Chris. If you guys want to keep your Bibles open, whether that's the physical version, digital version, whatever, it's always good just to make sure I'm actually saying the right things. Keep me honest. So, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Pivot Drive were proud to say they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. Now, some of you amongst in the room will probably recognise that as the first sentence of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stones. And you probably would have then went on and continue reading that first chapter, sort of when Albus Dumbledore gives Harry Potter to the Dursleys. And you probably just quite quickly moved on. But by doing so, we actually missed something. Now, when I was at university, I knew some people who studied English. And one of the most oversubscribed modules in that third year was on kids' books. And I had a friend in the CU, and she actually told me about how they had spent an hour dissecting this very sentence and all the nuggets within it. So, like, what does it mean for them to be proud to say they were normal? Not just normal, perfectly normal. Why did they have to point out the number 4 Pivot Drive? Why so formal? And the whole thank you very much, that's a quite closed statement. Why all that? And some of those sort of nuggets and gems we would miss if we didn't stop and think a bit more. You might have seen on YouTube on certain films, the Marvel cinematic universe is a great example, where people would go into so much detail, looking in all the props, all the little Easter eggs, seeing how they all link together and point to things that you just miss on your first viewing. And that's really the same with the book of Proverbs. We run that same risk. If we read through it like we would just like a normal book, we run the risk of treating this the same way and treat it more like we do just reading Twitter quite quickly or just the news headlines. We need to have that as sort of zooming in, zooming out to try and understand and actually process it a bit more rather than just treat it like a Chinese fortune cookie. And the book of Proverbs, by nature, is probably the most applicable book in the entirety of the Old Testament. It applies the principles of God's teachings to the entirety of life, to live a wise life. And let's be honest, the idea of a wise life isn't something we would naturally pursue these days. We'd like to pursue a successful life, maybe. A comfortable life, yes, definitely in our culture, but not so much about wisdom or a wise life. We just see that as for the philosophers, the Stoics, the people with nice, great, big, bushy beards that like to stroke it a lot. But the wisdom the book of Proverbs talk about is the walking in the way of life which is in harmony with God and his creation. It's about living and walking in the ways that God originally designed. And as a church, we are going through a summer series on the book of Proverbs, and in particularly looking at the theme of wisdom. Chris kicked off our series last week by looking at the foundation for wisdom, and that's the fear of the Lord. Pastor and Christian rapper Shai Lin puts it like this: to fear the Lord is to stand in awe before the reality of God. It's not like how we'd think about fear of snakes or anything sort of like we would just be scared of. It's that feeling of looking across the vastness of the ocean, standing on top of a cliff and seeing the sort of an awesomeness in the truest sense of being full of awe. And so this, the fear of the Lord, is the beginning of wisdom. And in order for us to seek wisdom, we need to seek God, for he himself is the foundation of wisdom. And so this morning, we're going to look into the book of Proverbs and then particularly focus on the last 2 verses that Chris read out. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, submit to him, and he will make your path straight. And let's just think about what it actually means for us to trust God and use wisdom for direction. The most difficult decisions we tend to make today aren't the small decisions like what we'd have for breakfast, but actually the big decisions that actually have an impact on our lives, our careers, where we live, etc. These are the ones we need direction for. And so the question is, how does this verse actually help us in that sort of situation? And as I've already said, the book of Proverbs is a book that helps us to live an act of faith. And so this morning, we're going to hone in on the verbs, the action words, and think about what they mean and how they apply. First, let's think about trust. The Proverbs calls us to trust in the Lord, and as a society, I think we actually really struggle with this notion of trust. And it's become more and more apparent as time has gone on. It's seen as a valuable commodity. Sort of companies and brands wants to earn that trust in order for us to continue to buy. If we lose trust in a brand, we don't buy them anymore. And when we lose that trust, we see things fail. So, for example, 2008, Northern Rock, there was that huge lack of trust in them as a brand. All the money went out, and the bank collapsed. And it's not just something in terms of the big stuff, but it's also, when you think about it, the individual stuff. Some of you may have seen the 2000 comedy, Meet the Parents. And within that, Robert De Niro plays this father figure who is just quite untrusting of everyone. And he has this notion of circle of trust, which basically the whole film is Ben Stiller trying to earn that trust and be part of his new family that he's joining in by marrying his daughter, Robert De Niro's daughter. But this circle of trust, I think ultimately as us individually, is actually getting smaller. Take a look at this slide. This is something I've found really interesting. Politicians, okay. Some people probably say we struggle to trust them in the first place. But this is a nice little sort of graph that I sort of found, actually showing how we as a society has diminished our levels of trust in the PM, in government, civil service, etc., following COVID. And I will caveat this was taken at a time when it was all the party scandals going on and Boris Johnson in power, so things might change a bit with Rishi. But it kind of shows that actually we're struggling to trust. And it's not just in terms of people, but also information. I feel sorry for Martin Lewis. So for those of you who don't know, this is Martin Lewis. He is the money sort of super saving expert. His basic career has been trying to think of, okay, how can I save people money so they can live better? And over social media, a deep fake video appeared of him supposedly promoting this scheme, this website that helped people save money and get more money. It's a deep fake. It was a video which was completely constructed by artificial intelligence, saying, oh, this is a great thing. Well, actually, it wasn't him at all. And so we're starting to struggle more and more with trying to process what we can and can't see. This was a couple of weeks ago. But this is something from this week, which I found really fascinating. So Rishi Sunak was at this Great British pub event down in London, and he pulls a pint just for cameras, as they do. And this is the real photo. Someone on social media, I think, edited it, maybe with AI, posted it around, and a Labour Party member shared this photo of Rishi pulling a pint, which I don't think anyone would be impressed of drinking, especially this person. And they shared it around thinking, oh, this is true. Let's put Rishi in bad light. It's like, actually, but it was fake. And one of the commentaries that's coming out more and more is, are we going to be able to trust what we read and see for the next general election next year? Trust is something that we are losing as a society. But actually, trust is something that is really difficult as well. We often talk about losing trust in things. It's painful when we put our trust in something and it goes. It backfires and we get hurt by it. I've been made redundant, and I've seen people who have also been made redundant. And a lot of the pain that comes around isn't so much about the frustration of losing a job or anything. It's that hurt of trust, being feel like you've been let go. The trust you've put in something is gone. It hurts. But with all that said and everything I've said, it's no wonder we're losing trust in things. It's no longer the circle of trust we have and develop is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. But actually, the Bible calls us to trust in God. In the passage we read, it's trust the Lord your God with all your heart. And other passages, blessed is the man who makes the Lord his trust and does not turn to the proud of those who go astray after a lie. Trust in the Lord forever, for the Lord himself is a rock eternal. So in a world where it says trust no one, difficult to trust, we're being called to trust in God. And that in itself is difficult. What happens if we don't trust in God? Well, what we do is we end up leaning on our own understanding. So when you think about what it means to lean, it's really the application of trust. For example, if I lean on this piano, I'm trusting two things. One, Michael's put the brakes on and it's not going to go anywhere. But two, that it's going to support my weight, that it's not going to roll away and I won't fall over looking like a fool. And so, where am I? But we do that in all applications of our lives. We trust other things, we lean on things, and when we lean on ourselves, that tends to go wrong. One of the things, I'm going to be honest, I really struggle to do is think physically, how do someone lean on themselves? I mean, lean on yourself so you can support your own weight like I did with the piano. You don't. It just falls flat on our face. But we do this in all aspects of our lives. So I mentioned earlier about circle of trust from Meet the Parents. And this whole idea of circle of trust is actually a psychological thing that people use for counselling. And look what's right in the middle, self. You're the centre determining what it is to trust, who it is to trust. You're the one sort of leaning on your understanding on who is the best people to trust. And you hear it all the time. Trust your instinct. Trust your gut. That's what society tells us. And it's all about us leaning on our own understanding. There was a document, and I show that in a slightly sort of psychological way, counselling way, about how we trust ourselves, but actually it has bigger implications. There was a Netflix documentary called Behind the Curve. It basically looked at a group of people who believed that the Earth was flat, and they did, and followed them as they did this experiment to try and prove that the Earth is indeed flat. And what happened right at the end, they do this experiment, and it doesn't go the way they expected. It doesn't fit their original hypothesis, and it showed that there's a slight curve where they were expecting it to be flat. And it completely, if you looked at it from a scientific perspective, it would really challenge their worldview. But what they did? Chuck it out, so it doesn't fit my hypothesis. It doesn't fit with my worldview. Now and that's an extreme example, but we do that all the time to ourselves. We have this worldview which we try and fit things into, and so we kind of leaning on our own understanding. But when you start thinking about it, leaning on our own understanding, putting ourselves as the ultimate authority, is that not the root cause of sin? If we look back into the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, they leant on their own understanding of what the tree and knowledge of good and evil were based on, and the information they had on the world. They took that on board, what the serpent had told them, and decided to trust their own understanding, lean on their own understanding rather than that of God. And if you go through some of the famous Bible stories, you'll see that time and time again. You think of Abraham, when he was promised a child from God. He initially trusted his own level of understanding, didn't he? He lent on his own understanding and slept with Hagar to give birth to Ishmael and thinking, okay, that is the child that God promised. That's my understanding of things. Not on the true understanding, leaning on God. We see this through the Israelites walking through the desert. They made an idol out of their own understanding of who God is, rather than waiting to see that for Moses with the Ten Commandments. Jonah leant on his own understanding of God's plan, and rather than trust God and go to Nineveh, he headed in the other direction. It's even in the New Testament, when you think of Peter. He challenged Jesus when what Jesus was talking about and what it meant to be the Messiah. And as a result, he got rebuked. When we lean on our own understanding, it ultimately becomes a pathway to idolatry, rather than the pursuit of righteousness, which, if you call yourself a Christian here today, that is what we're called to pursue. We're to pursue righteousness, not sin. So if we want to live a wise life, if we want to live in harmony with how God designed us to do, how do we do that? We are to submit to God. We don't like submitting, do we? Submission is a dirty word in our society. Let's be honest. Kids, the church, you know what I mean. Whenever your parents tell you to do something that you don't really want to do, like the washing up chores, tidying up your room, do you struggle to say yes to it? And let's be honest, if you're anything like me, you'd rather go off and do your own thing. You don't really want to submit to your parents to tidy up your room or anything like that. I know that was what I was like as a kid. And that's the same with all of us. We struggle to submit. And so when the Bible calls us to submit to God, we just find it difficult. So how do we change that? In order to submit, we first of all need to acknowledge who it is we're submitting to. So, as I mentioned, growing up, me keeping my room tidy was a bit of a chore. My mum really struggled to get me to do it. She would ask things nicely. No, still end up having stuff on the floor. It was only when she threatened to come round with a big black rubbish sack and put everything off the floor and put it in that bin that we were kicked into action and actually did anything. Because we realised, Mum's got the power to do that. She's got the keys, she's got access to the drawer with the black bag, and she can come round and pick things off while we're not around and put it in the back bag and we'll lose stuff. We need to tidy our room. And it really, that whole threat of it really put the fear into me and my sister about what she'd do. We acted on the realisation that our mum had authority and power to do what she said. In the same way that I submitted to my mum when I realised the authority that she had over me, or the same way we submit to judgments made by the courts of the land, by judges when they give rulings on things, it's because we recognise the power they have over us. And it's the same way it is with God. We can only be humble and submit to God when we realise who it is we're submitting to. It stems back to what Chris was talking about last week. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The awe of who God is leads us to humility. It's kind of like whenever you hear astronauts talk about their experience in space, they always talk about one of humility, of seeing the hugeness of Earth and realizing how small they are. It's that same view of God. We need to have a right-sized view of God in order to truly submit. And we need to first stop and kind of reflect on passages like Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I am God. We often, when we talk about this verse, we often think of the be still part, about quieting down. But actually, the key part of this is to know God, that I am God. And when we come into church on a Sunday morning, how often do we kind of think that through? Think about who it is we're coming to worship. So clever theologians often talk about 4 key words when they talk about God. The omnis, the omnipotent, God is all powerful. Omniscient, God is all knowing. Omnipresent, God is in all places. And omnivolent, God is all loving. Now let's step back. This is all the stuff that God is. And I am not. I'm going to be honest. I'm not all powerful. I'm not all knowing. I'm not all loving. And none of us are here. But God is. God is all of those things. We can't help but submit to who he is and trust in who he is, because we need to embrace that actually he is something that we are not. He is worthy of worship. If I was any of one of those things, then that would mean that I was the same as God, which I am completely not. So the question is then, if that is who God is, then why should I trust him? And it comes with the promise kind of at the end of the verse, this Proverbs, he will make your path straight. And it's a promise, but let's be honest, not how we probably want this promise to end. We like to pursue comfort, as I said, and so we'd probably rather this passage say something like, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and he will fix all your problems. Or he will bless you and make your life easy and pain-free. That's how we kind of want in our society. We want to pursue an easy life. We don't want to live a life of pain and struggle. So we can easily apply this verse and think, if we trust God, we would have an easy life. One of my favourite preachers, a guy called H.B. Charles Jr., puts it like this. Trusting God is about seeking God, not trying to use God for his own purposes. If this proverb is all about having our best lives now, then it would say something that God would ensure that you walk straight paths. But no, God makes our path straight. Our paths will ultimately end up becoming straight, but it's not in an instant. It's like when you think of anything. When you make a cake, for example, it's not just something that, I decide to make a cake, bing, there's a cake. No, it takes effort. You've got to break some eggs. You've got to mix it with flour. You've got to wait a while. There's a journey to make a cake. And it's the same with God, making our path straight. The focus on this verse is not so much about the journey, but more about the destination. When we go through trials and difficulties, when things don't go the way we want them to, we trust in God that ultimately he will make our path straight. We submit and trust that God will make our path straight for his purposes, not for ours, for his. And it's one thing, let's be honest, when we hear passages like this and sermons like this and think, it's easier to say things like this, to trust in God when you're going through the good times. But what about the difficult times? What about hard times, hardships? And we can think about, trust God. How can I in my situation? How can I in my circumstances? And if you have those thoughts, then I'm going to be honest. It is difficult. It is really hard. But I think when we look at the book of Proverbs, we need to kind of take a step back a bit and think less a bit more about the place where actually the book of Proverbs has come from. Chris mentioned last week that a lot of the book of Proverbs is attributed to King Solomon. Now, if you look at the entirety of Israel's history, King Solomon would have been seen as very much the golden age, the sort of when Israel were at its prime, within all its glory. They had built the temple. God was dwelling with them personally in a somewhere secure. And things could not have been better. And as part of their culture, they'd actually remember where they'd come from. Now, I'm going to be honest. This whole idea of having a national identity built on stories and histories and stuff and using that, that's not something I'm familiar with. It's not something as a Brit I get. But I work with people in America, and that is something they truly do get. Every year in November they have Thanksgiving, where they remember their history of people coming over on the Mayflower to start America. Or July the 4th, Independence Day. It's a day where they celebrate and remember the start of their country. And so in that culture, they had that constant reminder of where they've come from. And this is the same in Israel. They had that constant reminder of the nation's time in the wilderness, that constant reminder of when they've traveled 40 years, time without a king, time when it wasn't so good, when they were in captivity. And to Israel, where they were now in this high point was a result of trusting God that he would make their path straight. And if he made their path straight so far, how much further would they take them? God would take them in the future. Friends, if you call yourself a Christian here today, we have that same level of assurance that the Israelites have. For we were once far from God in our sin. And what has God done? He sent Jesus, his one and only Son, 100% man, 100% God, to die on the cross in our place as a ransom for our sin, to bring us back to him. We trust God in that moment, and he has made our path straight. And he's made our path straight in bringing us back into the relationship that he had designed us for. We trust in his saving power and not our own works. He has made our own path straight. And this is only a foretaste of things that are to come in terms of eternity. We're going to come into a time of worship now, and then we're going to take communion. Communion is something for Christians only. So if you don't call yourself a Christian, when the cups come past, please feel free to just let them, don't take one, just let them pass. Our salvation stems from the fact that we trust in God with all our hearts and lean not in our own understanding. By saying we need Jesus, we submit to him with all that we are, and we realize who we are in contrast to who he is. He has made our path straight. And this is the thing. If we can trust God in our cosmic salvation, which is huge when you think of what he's done, how much more can we trust him in all aspects of our lives? Because as I said, trust is the application of humility. And so let's humble ourselves now as we come to worship. Band.
soul.